We are at week number 4 of a 19-week series on the Gospel of John. I know I promised you 21, but I finished it now and I've squeezed it down to 19. So here we go. Let's pick it up. Now we learned that we're going verse by verse through the Gospel of John, and we learned that gospel is a unique literary genre, a family of literature, if you will. And we learned that it's a hybrid. It's a combination of two things. It's a first century Greco-Roman biography, and it's also a first century sermon format. And that hybrid has been pulled together in this genre we now refer to as a gospel. And a gospel has, over the centuries now, become to describe essentially a story about Jesus. And we're studying the gospel according to John. That's important. It's the gospel, meaning the message, the life of Jesus, but it's the gospel according to, from the perspective of John. There's the gospel according to Matthew, gospel according to Mark, gospel according to Luke, gospel according to John. So think of the gospel as this diamond, and we're looking at it from 4 different perspectives, according to 4 different individuals. Now, a few weeks ago, we began by studying the prologue of John's gospel, and we learned the prologue is the part of the document that introduces the main characters and the main themes in the document. The prologue kind of gives you an insider's perspective of the individual that is being studied. So you and I have knowledge when we read the prologue. We have knowledge as we're studying this gospel that the people that in the gospel itself didn't have. We have some inside information about who this individual truly was as he's interacting with the world. So you've got some information that they didn't have. And the key component to John's prologue, the inside information that you were given, was right in the very first verse and verse 14 of chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. And remember, we learned the word was logos. That's the word for word. It's the ancient Greek word. This was written in ancient Greek. And logos meaning word. And logos was a term that was relatively familiar in that first century. It was used by the ancient Greeks to describe the energy, the principle, the force behind the universe. Think the force in Star Wars, or the force, the principle in Eastern mysticism. It's non-personal, it's not a god, it's just this inanimate force behind the whole universe. And that was the concept of logos for the ancient Greeks. And then this guy named Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher, he took that in the first century and he kind of adapted it to Judaism and said, well, that's kind of God's logos, God's force, God's energy that created the universe. He wasn't thinking a person, he was just thinking this energy. And then it was also a term that you read in the Old Testament, and the word of the Lord came to them saying. So it was how God revealed himself to people was also the term logos. And what John did was he combined all of that and he adapted it all and he sort of crunched it all together, if you will, transformed it, redefined it all into the Logos, the Word of God. The Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So John's telling us that this Word is not just this energy, this force, this principle. This Word is the person. Is the person that we know as Jesus of Nazareth. This Word was God. And he became flesh, he took on flesh and dwelt among us. And John's gospel is this description of what happened as God took on flesh and interacted with us and dwelt among us. Okay? So, John reveals the Word wasn't just this principle or force or energy. The Word is a person with all the attributes of deity who took on the form of humanity and lived amongst us. And now we're following along as John describes what happened as the Word interacted with humanity. And last week, John described the events just prior to the official launching of Jesus' earthly ministry. And John began with interacting with the person we know as John the Baptist. Not the same John who wrote this gospel, a different John. John was a very common name back then, John the Baptist. And we saw the role that John the Baptist played in launching Jesus' public ministry. And we also followed along last week as Jesus began to gather his first disciples. Now today, we're continuing to track the early days of Jesus' ministry, and we pick things up in the first verse of the second chapter of John's Gospel. John chapter 2, starting at verse 1. It's commonly referred to here as the invitation to the wedding in Cana. Now, as you turn to John 2:1, let me remind you of a passage from Mark's Gospel. We actually went verse by verse through Mark a few years ago. You can probably find that on our website. But Mark chapter 2, verses 18 to 20. It says, now John's disciples, this is John the Baptist, John the Baptist's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John the Baptist's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? And Jesus answered, well, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he's with them? They can't, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they'll fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins. That sort of gives us a bit of a hint off the top of what we're going to be looking at today. The contrast, we go from Jesus made the contrast here between John the Baptist and his disciples' ascetic lifestyle, this kind of rough, basic lifestyle, versus Jesus and his followers are going to banquets and weddings and drinking wine. What's the difference? What's going on with that? And so there's that contrast, but also then the concept of wine and festivals and celebrations. All of those themes are kind of going to be woven together here today as we come up against this passage that's kind of a little bit confusing to people over the centuries. So we're going to do our best to explain what's going on here. Now, to help us understand what we're about to read, we're going to do our best to understand the context of a first century Jewish wedding back then. Now, our details when it comes to first century Jewish wedding ceremonies is limited, but here's what we think we know. Now, we know that marriage back in the first century in the Jewish culture was preceded by a betrothal, a time of betrothal, which is, we would call that an engagement, but betrothal and engagement were very different. When you were betrothed back in the first century, it was much more serious, much more binding for them than an engagement is for us today. To break off an engagement in our culture requires nothing more than returning the ring, if you're lucky, and canceling the caterer, right? But to break off a betrothal in the first century required a legal certificate of divorce. So if you're betrothed or engaged in the first century, you were legally married. Though experientially you weren't married, you did not have a sexual relationship, nor did you cohabitate yet. But you were, legally speaking, a couple. And you see that in the story of Jesus or in Joseph and Mary when they were betrothed. That's why, Joseph pondered quietly giving her a certificate of divorce. Well, they weren't married. Why would he divorce her? Because they were betrothed. And so they were legally married, though not experientially fully married yet. Now, when it came time for the betrothal season to end and transition into a formal marriage, they would have a wedding ceremony. We don't know a lot about first century wedding ceremonies, but a predictable series of events we do know about. On a Wednesday, if the bride was a virgin, or a Thursday, if the bride was a widow, the bridegroom and his friends would make their way in a procession to the bride's home. This usually happened at night with this procession of everyone carrying torches. And there would likely be some speeches and some expression of goodwill as the bridegroom goes to the bride's home. And then he would take her and they would have another procession all going back to the groom's home where they would have a wedding feast, a wedding celebration that often lasted for about a week. A week. And the responsibility to pay for all of the food and the wine fell upon the groom. back then. Praise God that's changed today. But anyway, so that's how that all worked back then. And if you ran out of food or drink at a wedding in a shame-based culture, shame-honor culture, that was a huge, huge embarrassment. And there's even some historical evidence that if a groom ran out of food at his wedding, that his bride's family could actually sue him. And so there's evidence of lawsuits when that happened because of the embarrassment. Now, in the Old Testament, a wedding is a symbol of messianic days. As well, Jesus often used wedding and banquet symbolism when referring to the kingdom of God. And the wedding motif is also used in the book of Revelation, the marriage feast, the wedding supper of the Lamb. So weddings and celebrations and banquets were big symbolism for the Messiah and the end days and celebrations of God's kingdom. And if there was one word to sum up what a Jewish wedding is all about, it would have to be joy. I mean, that's what weddings were all about, still are, of course, but in a massive way in the Jewish mindset, weddings were all about joy. And they're all about a celebration of joy. And as we're about to learn in a moment, wine was a huge part, and still is, of the element of joy. Okay, with that as a background, let's pick it up. Chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. On the third day, we're not going to get into the rabbit trail of what the third day means. It's just the sequential events of John talking about from when he started tracking Jesus' ministry. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. Now, just for maps purposes, where's Cana of Galilee? There's the Mediterranean Sea here, and here's the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea. Jerusalem's about here. Nazareth is about here, and Cana would be about here. We're not quite sure 100% where Cana is. I've been to the place they think Cana was, but it's not too far from Nazareth, just a little north of Nazareth, west of the Sea of Galilee. Just a village, not a very big place. Okay, now this was likely the wedding of a close family member or friend of Jesus' family, okay? Number 2, as your outline says, Jesus would have had only 5 disciples with him at this early stage in his ministry. So he hasn't called all of his disciples yet. This is very early on. He's only got about 5 with him. So now we come to the crisis at the wedding. Let's pick it up in verse 3. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, now clearly this is maybe a couple days into the wedding perhaps. Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now this is a little bit awkward, so let's dig into this a bit. As we said, wine played an important role in Jewish weddings. In fact, there's a rabbinical saying that there's no rejoicing without the wine. You can't have a party without wine, the rabbi said. Now, this isn't what you're thinking. This isn't about people getting drunk in their celebration. Though, after a couple days of drinking, you do get a little lightheaded, perhaps. I've been told, Jan, is that true? So there is an element of that. But first century wine, we need to know, was less potent than 21st century wine. Wine in the first century was roughly 1 part wine to 3 parts water. So it was highly watered down. 1 part wine to 3 parts water, first century wine. But it still was and is an essential component to a Jewish celebration. It's still a symbol of joy and celebration in the Jewish culture. Just like we might say, you can't have a birthday celebration without a cake and candles. They would say, you can't have a wedding and truly rejoice without the presence of wine. So know this, wine is a cornerstone. It's essential to joy and celebration at a wedding. Well, apparently, at this wedding in the town of Cana, that's exactly what happened. They ran out of wine, and the celebration was still in full swing. Like, this is worst case scenario. So here's the question. Why was this a crisis in Mary's mind? It's not her wedding. Why is this a big deal? Is she meddling here? What's going on? And why did she bring the matter to Jesus, who was just a guest at the wedding? And why did Jesus respond the way that he responded? So let's unpack what takes place here. In verse 3 there, we see, as your outline says, Mary brings an issue to Jesus. That's your next blank. Mary brings an issue to Jesus. Let's reread verse 3. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." So why was Mary involved? Well, as your outline says, she may have been quite close to the groom's family and sought to help them avoid the shame and embarrassment of such a scenario. So she may, it's possible, have been quite close to the groom's family. Or, as your outline says, she may have been involved in arranging the wedding. Okay? So her response implies that she's involved somehow. She's either close to the groom's family and trying to help him avoid the embarrassment here, or she was involved maybe in arranging this wedding. Okay, if that's true, though, why would she bring the matter to Jesus? Why would she? What does Jesus have to do with this? Now, folks, here's where we need to be very careful. We need to be very careful how we look at this situation. We can't look at it through the eyes of someone who knows what Jesus can do in the miraculous realm. Don't think, well, obvious why she's bringing it to Jesus, because, well, he's the Messiah, he's God in flesh, and he does miracles, and so she's wanting him to do a miracle. No, wrong. It's not that at all. He hasn't done any miracles. Okay? He's not revealed himself publicly as the Messiah yet. Which she knows, yeah, but we'll get to that in a second. But so we need to not look at this through the lens of what we know takes place later. Let's go back to what Mary was thinking at this time. This is her son. He's 30 years old. He's been a carpenter up until this point in his life. Okay? And so she's not thinking all miracles, none of that. So what's going on? Well, as your outline says, as likely a widow, it appears that Joseph, her husband, was deceased at this point. Mary may simply have been used to relying upon her firstborn son to help her. So, as likely a widow, Mary may simply have been used to relying upon her firstborn son to help her. Jesus was her firstborn son of at least 7 siblings, it looks like. And so 7 children. And so, she was used to looking to Jesus as the firstborn to help her in making decisions and to be the man in the family. So it could have been just a reflex. She's involved with this, and Jesus, you're not going to believe this. They just told me that they've run out of wine. Like, she goes to him to help her. Perhaps that. But remember, as your outline says, letter C, Jesus was not yet known as a miracle worker. So it's unlikely she expected a supernatural fix. Jesus was not yet known as a miracle worker. So it's unlikely Mary expected a supernatural fix. Letter D on your outline, from Jesus' response, it's possible that Mary, who remembered all that took place at his birth, was subtly calling on her son's messianic authority to remedy the situation. Messianic authority is that next blank there. So, remember, this is the same Mary who, when the angel appeared to her and made her the promise, and then Elizabeth, baby jumped in Elizabeth's womb, and then Mary and Joseph go, and the angels and the shepherds and the wise men a couple years later, and then the scripture says that she stored or treasured all of these things in her heart. So Mary, as a young mom, is thinking about all this. She's trying to piece it together. She doesn't know her son is the Word become flesh. Let's understand this. Mary wasn't thinking, God is in my womb. She was thinking the Messiah, but Messiah means a political ruler. That'd be like thinking the next Prime Minister of Canada is in my womb. That's kind of how she would have been thinking. Okay? The greatest prime minister our nation's ever going to have, that's always been promised, that's going to be my son. Wow. That's more the line of thinking, a messianic thinking back then, okay? She wasn't thinking, a miracle worker, God in flesh. No, no, no. They later come to realize that. You know that because of the prologue. But she didn't know that at that time. So let's not transfer back onto them what we know today, okay? So it could be, as we see from Jesus' response, that Mary was, starting to connect dots or wanting, maybe she's thinking in her mind, okay, you're the Messiah. You're 30 years old now. When are you going to do something? Like, be the Messiah now. We don't know. We're surmising here. But from Jesus' response, he seemed to discern that Mary was not just approaching him as her eldest son, but also seemed to be approaching Jesus as the promised Messiah. And all of the baggage, all of the first century Jewish expectations that she would have held in her mind regarding that role. Because Jesus seemed to perceive in her, from his response, which we'll unpack here in a second, that she was coming to him more than her son, but with an expectation that he had authority that she was calling on here. So let's look how Jesus responds to his mother. Again, look at verse 4. Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my hour has not yet come. Now, Jesus' response has prompted all kinds of discussion over the centuries. As your outline says, letter A, the word woman, also used while he was on the cross in chapter 19, verse 26, sounds harsher in English than it does in the original language. So it sounds harsher to us than it did in the original language. As your outline says, it was not a term of disrespect. It was not a term of disrespect, but as your outline says, neither was it a term a son would use in conversation with his mother. Okay? So it's a little bit awkward. Okay? It sounds harsher in English than it did then. It's not a term of disrespect, but neither was it a term you would use talking to your mom. So there's a tension in this term. It's not affectionate, neither is it harsh. Woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied. He said, my time, my hour has not yet come. Now the phrase, as your outline says, the phrase, why do you involve me, was a common Jewish idiom, a figure of speech, communicating a level of distancing from a request. So it's a phrase that was not uncommon, and it revealed there was a level of distancing between the person and the request that was being given to them. One scholar made this observation. He said, this expression is common as a Semitic idiom, and it always distances the two parties involved. The tone is not rude, but it certainly is abrupt. That's Dr. D.A. Carson. He said, it's not rude, but it is distinctly abrupt. So, as your outline says, combining letters A and B, there appears to be a respectful but intentional distancing taking place between Jesus and his mother at this crucial moment. So there appears to be a respectful but intentional distancing taking place between Jesus and his mother at this crucial moment. Again, let me quote D.A. Carson. He writes this, Jesus, however courteously, is declaring at the beginning of his ministry his utter freedom from any kind of human advice, agenda, or manipulation. He has now embarked on his ministry, the purpose of his coming, and his only source is his heavenly Father's will. So, when you combine woman and why do you involve me, there's a tension here, marking a transition taking place in the relationship. As parents, there's stages of parenting, and there's a stage when your children, just take steps away from you. And there's stage when your children are just your little best friends. And, I raised 2 sons and 2 daughters, and Jan was along for the ride. But as we raise the children, there's a stage when your daughter's your daddy's little girl, and then you get to a stage when they're embarrassed to be seen in your presence. Something happens at some point in that stage, and then they come to be your friends again. But there's a distancing that takes place, and then there's a moment when they're just no longer your kids in the same way that they were your children. And even when they become adults, then they're off embarked in their own lives and their own families, and there's a relational transitions that take place. It appears that's what's happening here to a degree, but even more so when this is the Word, God become flesh. And so, up until this point, Jesus has been seen as Mary's eldest son. And she would go and ask him to do favors and things perhaps. And at this moment, he's saying, there's a distancing taking place. Mary, woman, why are you involving me in this? Like, I'm stepping back from this, and our relationship isn't going to be the same after this. You're still my mother. I still love you. But things are about to change. You're not setting the agenda. I'm now stepped out into my ministry. I've embarked my public ministry, and your influence over me is changing from this moment on. Reread verse 4. Woman, why do you involve me? And then here's the key phrase why we think that she was calling upon his messianic authority. He said, my hour has not yet come. As your outline says, whenever Jesus referred to his hour, he was referring to his crucifixion, resurrection, and glorification. Whenever Jesus used the term hour, he was referring to his crucifixion, resurrection, and then eventual glorification. So again, we need to remind ourselves that we have information that Mary did not have at that moment. As well, we need to remind ourselves that Jesus had information regarding what was in the heart of Mary that we don't have. So he discerned something in Mary's heart and Mary's motivation. And it's quite possible, and it seems to me probable, that Mary was wanting Jesus to reveal himself at a level and in a way that was not yet proper in the plan of God. So as your outline says, letter E, Jesus was seeing the full messianic role that Mary could not yet see. Jesus was seeing the full messianic role that Mary could not yet see. So as best as I understand this moment and this exchange, as your outline says, letter F, Jesus was saying, and this is just my paraphrase, Jesus was saying, the time for displaying my full messianic authority has not yet come. The time for displaying my full messianic authority has not yet come. You want me to step up and use some authority to fix the situation. And I'm telling you, the time's not right yet for what you're wanting me to do. Okay, let's read verse 5. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you. So, as your outline says, number 3, clearly Mary did not take Jesus' response as a rejection or a rebuke. So clearly, Mary did not take Jesus' response as a rejection or a rebuke. In fact, she's a real example to us here. Mary committed the matter to Jesus, and she fully trusted his judgment. So at this point, she's a real example to us in prayer, if you think about it. In prayer, what do? We see a need. We see a problem that needs fixing. And we know Jesus has the authority to fix the problem. So what do? We bring it to him, and then we leave it with him and trust him with the decision. That's what she's doing here. And she's an example to us here. Let this be, in your mind, an example of prayer. Okay, and Jesus often does not do what we want him to do right away or the way we want him to expect him to do it. But we step back and trust him. You know, you have the authority. And so she said to the other servants there, do whatever he tells you. I don't know what he's going to do, if anything, But whatever he tells you to do, do it. So again, that gives us a hint that she was involved somehow in the arranging of this behind the scenes. Otherwise, a guest instructing the servants, who does that? But she had some authority somehow at this wedding. Okay, let's keep reading. Where the next section is from ritual purification to real celebration. What perhaps is really going on here? Let's read verse 6. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Okay? So you got 120, 180 gallons of wine. That's quite a party. So, as your outline says, stone jars were used to store ceremonial washing water because, unlike clay jars, they would not become ceremonially unclean. So the stone ones would not become ceremonially unclean like the clay would. So there's a hint here. Why is John particularly mentioning this? These are ceremonial washing. Now, there's a ceremonial law, there's a civil law, there's the moral law in the Old Testament. Ceremonial law talks about ceremonial cleansing versus actual cleansing. So, you had these water jars, and every home had to have these ceremonial jars. Why? Because you would be ritually cleaned. Doesn't mean you would necessarily be physically cleaned, but in the ritual, in the ceremony, you are now pronounced clean by this, okay? You had ritual purification as opposed to actual purification. So these ceremonial jars are there for people to ritually purify themselves, ceremonially purify themselves, and that's the water that's being used here. Read verse 7. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Now that's an interesting detail. They filled them right to the brim. As your outline says, Jesus ensured that the jars were filled to the brim so that nothing else could be added. So that nothing else could be added. Fill them right to the brim. Why? Well, perhaps so there would be no room for future conspiracy theories about how there was space left in the jars and they secretly added wine to the water. No, water right to the top so nothing more could be added. Okay? Read verses 8 to 10. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He didn't realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everybody brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you've saved the best till now." Like, you hear what he's saying. Normally you serve the best at the beginning when people's taste buds are really there and they've got their full faculties. And then later, after a couple days, when people are a little bit tipsy and lightheaded, that's when you bring out the cheap stuff. But you did the opposite. You gave the cheap stuff off the top, and now you're bringing out the best. This is incredible. Keep in mind, because what he's saying here, because this is the symbolism of what's taking place. So in other words, number 3 in your outline, apparently the quality of the wine was exceptional. The quality of the wine was exceptional. Now, the master of the banquet, by the way, would perhaps be akin to a master of ceremonies at a modern wedding. So they're not a servant, nor are they an employee. Neither were they involved in the planning of the wedding. They're a guest. That's why he's going to them and saying to the bridegroom, "Wow, what have you done here?" Well, if he was involved in the planning, he would know it all. But he doesn't. They're a guest, and they're appointed to be more of a formal host or a spokesperson for the groom, keeping the celebration moving forward. So they're more like an MC, okay? By the way, from this principle, I take and apply to our staff over the years here at Broadway, the sort of the principle of excellence in everything that we do. Everything God does, he does with excellence. And so that's why I always encourage our staff and our team. At Broadway Church, we should always be pursuing excellence. Excellence doesn't mean perfection. Excellence, as we define it here, is the best we can do with the resources at hand. That's excellence, as we define it here. So I'll use this at times in teaching our staff. We should always give God our best. And we should always seek to produce our best, because whenever God does something, he does it with excellence. He didn't just give some cheap wine in a box. He gave the choicest wine is what he produces. And you and I should do the same in everything that we do for the kingdom of God. Okay, let's do a quick review as we keep moving on. What have we learned so far? Jesus and his disciples have been invited to a wedding. It must have been a close family member or close friend of the family. Mary seems intimately involved in the planning of the wedding. She's aware of what's happening behind the scenes details. She knew before anyone else. Even the master of ceremonies didn't know that they had run out of wine. So she's close to the arrangements here. Knowing about something as potentially embarrassing as running out of wine means she had close inside knowledge of this wedding. Jesus was not yet known as a miracle worker at this time. So she did know that her son was the promised Messiah, and perhaps she felt it was time for him to reveal himself as the coming deliverer and ruler of Israel in some way. She did not know what Jesus could or would do, but she was calling in a favor. Jesus partially and respectfully distances himself from her expectations without entirely rejecting her request. So Jesus essentially says, I'm not going to do nothing, but neither am I going to do everything you want me to do. That's kind of the tension that's managed here. And then Jesus supernaturally produces a high-quality batch of wine, which leads us to the next question. Why did Jesus do this? What did Jesus accomplish by doing this? Well, let's pull some of the threads together that we've learned today. We've learned that Old Testament prophets and Jesus himself often linked the messianic time, or final days, with references to weddings, feasts, and banquets. We learned that Jewish weddings were all about joy. We learned that in the Jewish mind, in the Jewish culture, joy wasn't possible without the presence of wine. So then, when you pull all this together, you can see the symbolic power and the message that looking back on Jesus' ministry, the first miracle would have conveyed. As your outline says, we now see that what took place was highly symbolic. It was highly symbolic. The ceremonial water represented the old order of Jewish law and custom. Jesus replaced it with something much better. The ceremonial water represented the old order of Jewish law and Jewish custom, and Jesus replaced it with something much better, new wine. So we've got the ceremonial and the ritual replaced by the actual and the eternal. That's what's happening here. And read verse 11. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, John uses two important words to summarize the event. Sign, first of all, which is neither a naked display of power nor a trick to impress the masses, as your outline says, but a display of authority that points beyond itself to a deeper reality. That's what a sign does. It points beyond itself to something deeper, something more important. Signs are not ends in themselves. Signs point beyond themselves. That's what a sign does, right? A sign doesn't say, look at me. A sign says, pay attention to this. And that's what Jesus' signs, his works, did. They pointed beyond to something. So it wasn't just about the cool thing of creating wine. It was pointing to a truth. So to what was this first sign pointing? Well, the second word there is glory. As your outline says, a word that came to be code for a visible expression of God's presence, perfection, and power. Glory is code for a visible expression of God's perfection, presence, and power. It's like the shining, when you polish your car and the sun beams off and it blinds you. That's a polished car does that because you're flattening the surface and you're getting a truer bounce of the light. That perfection of your surface is the sun's being reflected off of it. That's kind of what's happening here. The glory of God is just the perfection, the brightness of God's nature and excellence. So according to John's account, this event was the first really, demonstration of the presence and power and excellence of God's nature in the life of Jesus, the Word who became flesh. So as your outline says, the result was a marked increase in faith on the part of Jesus' disciples. The result was a marked increase. Wow, there's something incredible about you we see in you. Who are you? Okay. Now, I had hoped and promised last week that this week we would get to the money changers in the temple. Clearly, we don't have time. So next week, Lord willing, that's what we're going to touch on. And also, so we're going to ask the question, are we angering God today when we sell things on church property? Is that what the lesson is from the money changers in the temple? And also next week, we're going to touch on when Jesus said to the Pharisees, destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. Now, we're going to look at that passage, in a way that perhaps you've never looked at it before. I know I had never considered this before. As I studied this passage, it appeared there's an argument made, and I think a relatively convincing one, that at that time, Jesus' disciples thought he lost that argument with the Pharisees. Again, the shame, honor culture, there's a whole style of debate that happened back then. And on the surface, at that moment when Jesus had this back and forth debate with the Pharisees, at the moment, it looked like Jesus lost the debate. But then John says they later realized what he was really saying and realized, oh no, he won that debate. So we're going to be looking at that next week.